Hello, all. I know you probably didn't expect to hear my voice today. The reason I wanted to do this is because we're at a point in our history book where I think it makes better sense to approach this topically rather than trying to touch on every piece of what you find in these chapters. Reason being, we can look at where we are in our book, and obviously, we're not going to finish all of it. But there are certain things that I would like to be able to spend more time on, such as the Civil War, and then also being able to progress ahead to get up to like more like the 19th, 20th centuries. So we can see some things that have been more recent, like the World Wars, for example. Not sure how much time we'll get with those, but at least open up that possibility. And so, really, there are just a few highlights that I think we really need from these eras to be able to kind of contextualize what we're headed to in terms of the Civil War and then beyond there. So, I wanted to do this brief video today. I don't think it'll be super long. I know I've spent a while on the introduction here, but with slavery as a focus topic, it's going to show up again, of course, quite a lot when we talk about the Civil War. But we haven't talked about it lately, and there are some things that happened in the 19th century, in the decades before the Civil War, that are pretty crucial for understanding the situation the country found itself in terms of how people viewed this idea of slavery, and what was happening as the country grew. How was it being dealt with? So I want to do this because slavery, it might seem way back in our history, but it's actually something that, well, was, yes, there early on, but it's also an issue of today. And what we see here, two things that make us recognize why slavery is still an issue today. If you can see the chart here, this shows numbers. The darker a country is showing here, the more slaves you find in that place. So places like India and Russia and Democratic Republic of Congo, that's the one right here in the middle of Africa, those places have slaves in the hundreds of thousands or even millions. If you notice, even the United States, though, weirdly enough, has somewhere around like 50, 60,000 slaves. That might seem pretty shocking because obviously slavery is illegal in the United States. And it is quite different than it used to be. When we talk about slavery today, it's kind of any time when someone is held against their will to be doing something that is, where another person essentially dictates their life in some kind of way. And so, this, of course, we hear about sex slavery as an issue, but it can also be things like labor slavery, such as you promise someone a visa to come to the United States that you'll take care of everything, and then you steal their passport and force them to work in a factory. This happened not too long ago. This was found out. I can't actually remember where it was. I should have looked that up, but it only occurred to me now. And you really abuse someone's labor and you don't pay them right, and you lie to them and control their lives. So those sorts of things happen. Of course, it's illegal to do that now, unlike a couple hundred years ago when it wasn't. So that's a big difference, but it is still a problem. The other thing that we see down here in the corner, this is a lady, Marianne Williamson, who actually ran for president in the last election. I think she dropped out fairly early, but there's a quote here where she says, "It is time to realize this country will not heal until it recognizes that the economic gap between blacks and whites comes from a great injustice we've never dealt with." So, what she's advocating here is something called reparations. Reparations is a concept that says if you were mistreated in the past, particularly economically, and the attitude is if you were treated as a slave, then in a sense you were stolen from because the work that you did, you didn't earn what you should have for it. And then meanwhile, someone else is benefiting from the labor that you're putting in. So it's an argument that says that should be righted in some kind of way, that the people who were mistreated before ought to receive some sort of payment, some kind of compensation for what they dealt with. Now, a lot of people very strongly disagree with the idea of reparations. We can talk about it more later. To me, in practice, it is something that's pretty confusing and difficult to think about how it would work. Uh, because, of course, for example, some people are descended from both slaves and slave owners. And it's like, well, how do you determine what that person is supposed to do, right? And so it's a dicey, uh, strange issue to think about, but it is something that some people are very seriously considering even today. Okay, but taking it back historically, I'm just going to say in brief that slavery is something that we see from the very early days of our country. And what you can also see is the mentality that led to this idea that owning a slave would be an okay thing to do kind of spawns from this idea that the United States, well, before it was the United States, when it was a colony, had these people called indentured servants. We talked about this a while ago, but indentured servants, in some ways, were treated somewhat similarly to slaves. They could be bought and sold, is the one thing that is most similar to slaves. But there were differences. They came voluntarily, someone else paid their passage, and they did receive their freedom after a period of time. Something that made the type of slavery that is found in America, eventually the United States, that distinguishes it from slavery that you might find in other places historically is that a slave was considered someone's property for life, and even their children became the property of the slaveholder. So that is what we call chattel slavery, where the slave is viewed purely on legal grounds as someone's property, that even their children become that person's property. So it's obviously a pretty terrible situation, terrible system, and it's existed since the 17th century. Okay, and of course, when the United States became its own country, slavery didn't go away. So people argue today about what the attitudes were of the founders of the country. Were they actually just slaveholders who really supported it? Were they hypocrites? Were they abolitionists, meaning people who wanted to end this system? And what we see here is a quote from Abraham Lincoln. Yeah, I just picked an image that was a little, more interesting from a movie there, Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter, which I don't think he really was, but who knows? Anyway, the quote says, "Thus the thing is hid away in the Constitution, just as an afflicted man hides away a wen, which is like an ailment, or a cancer, which he dares not cut out at once, lest he bleed to death, with the promise, nevertheless, that the cutting may begin at the end of a given time." So what Lincoln's saying here is that um, the founders, yeah, they didn't get rid of slavery, but they kind of tried to talk around it. They were sort of embarrassed by it. They believed that it was going to end at some point. We've talked about the Three-Fifths Compromise before. This is one way where they hashed out a compromise because the situation is there were people who were very opposed to slavery even back then, but they felt like, well, if we push too hard to try to end this right now, the whole union's going to fall apart. And so we just are going to act based in the belief that if we can make some compromises now, this is an issue that'll kind of work itself out once the country becomes stronger. But for now, we don't want to create chaos where everything just falls apart. And so I'm not going to read that one. But the other things that we find, there's two other provisions in the Constitution early on. There was an actual ban on banning slavery, or a prohibition on banning slavery, which said that it could not be banned until the year 1808, which tells us two things. One, yeah, they were making a law to protect slavery then, but also there must have been an impulse for people to already want to end it. You don't need to pass a law that says, hey, you can't do this yet, unless there was somebody who was considering it and trying to think about doing it. And in fact, in 1807, Thomas Jefferson signed a bill abolishing the slave trade. Not all of slavery, but the slave trade, meaning that the United States would not bring in any more slaves on ships from outside, right? There's another law built into the Constitution on fugitive slaves, and it says that the free states where slavery was illegal could not essentially discharge a slave. If somebody escaped to a free state, that didn't automatically mean that they were granted their freedom. Now, in practice, this was ignored frequently because people in these free states just hated slavery, so they weren't really sympathetic to trying to do the bidding of those in the South. This is something that kind of went back and forth for quite a while in terms of how fugitive slaves were treated, but it is a provision that was made. Okay, so like I said, the founders, they had this hope that slavery would kind of go away on its own. The country would get stronger. It had gone away on its own in certain states in the more industrialized North. So they felt like maybe that's going to happen everywhere. Well, it did not happen. And one of the main reasons is that in 1793, Eli Whitney invented, or maybe copied, at least introduced to the South, the cotton gin. Gin is a word that's an abbreviation for engine. So we say maybe copied because there seem to have been designs in England that maybe he got a hold of and somehow brought with him to America. But whatever the case, he is responsible for making this a widespread thing that was used in the American South. And this machine sped up the process considerably for removing cotton seeds from cotton, which was a really difficult, tedious process that had relied on slaves. So one might think, well, hey, once somebody did that, you can rely on machines more. You don't actually need as many slaves. Maybe slavery will disappear on its own. But unfortunately, what happened instead is cotton became more profitable, much easier to process. And when it became more profitable, the number of the slaves in the South rose from about 1.5 million in 1820 to 3.2 million in 1850, or 37% of the total Southern population. So even though the slave trade was outlawed in 1808, a high birth rate, which was encouraged by slaveholders, kept increasing the slave population. So they were like, hey, we need more slaves. I mean, that's what they thought. How can we get them? Well, we can't import them anymore. But if they have babies and have children, they'll grow up and be our slaves. So also now there's a national constitution. And that means that states have much more to say in each other's governance, meaning you can't just kind of leave well enough alone when one state's doing one thing and you do your own thing because you're under a national constitution. There's much more a sense of we should be on the same page regarding at least kind of core understanding of what our laws will be. And slavery is a big divider in terms of how people are living in some states versus others. So in 1819, the Union was evenly divided between 11 free and 11 slave states because if it shifted to have one more free or one more slave state, then all of a sudden those states become really powerful in the national government. So Congress had established a process for new states to join the Union, but both sides feared a tip of the balance. And what we saw was Missouri applied and wanted to be a new state, a slave state. But the free states were not okay with this because they said, we are not going to be okay with having another slave state to tip the balance of the Union. So the compromise that was worked out was called the Missouri Compromise. And what wound up happening is that Missouri joined the Union as a slave state. Maine was carved out of a section in New England to become a free state. So you had one of each join at the same time. And but John Quincy Adams said, I take it for granted that the present question is a mere preamble, which is kind of like a preview, a title page to a great tragic volume. So what he's saying here is that, well, okay, we kind of settled things right now, but this is just sort of kicking this issue down the curb. As the country continues to grow, we're going to continue to have more and more issues with this. And slavery is not an issue that's just going to go away. It's like, okay, we can breathe a little easier right now. We worked this out, but it's not solved. So we're going to see more in class about how that worked out, but this is where I got to stop this video for now. I'll see you all soon.